In this hands-on lab for troubleshooting, we'll take a look at a VM that the user is complaining is not getting connectivity out to the internet. We want to verify that that's indeed happening, identify the causes of why it's happening, resolve it, and verify it. Let's begin. So we begin by logging on to the vSphere web client, logged on as administrator at vSphere.local, and the challenge was that the VM TC-08, that virtual machine, is claimed to not have connectivity to the internet. So one of the first things we might want to do is just test it to verify that that's true. So to test it, let's go ahead and right-click on VM-TC-08, and from the Actions menu for VM-TC-08, we'll go ahead and hover over Power, and we'll click on Power On. Let's also go ahead and open up a console to VMTC08. We can right click on it here, and from the Actions menu, go to Open Console and click on that. And I would say it's a bit more than a network connectivity issue because this machine is booting to the BIOS setup utility, which means that from here, the guest operating system isn't running. So instead of making any changes here to the BIOS setup, let's do this. Let's go ahead back to the vSphere web client. I'm going to power off that machine. We'll right click on VMTC-08 on the left hand side and hover over Power. And you'll notice here we do not get the shutdown guest OS option, and that's because the guest OS is not running, and also it's not running VMware tools, which allows the graceful shutdown of a guest. So let's just go ahead and use the power off option, like pulling the power, clicking in yes to confirm, and let's go ahead and boot it one more time. Maybe it was just a glitch. So we'll right click on VMTC08, hover over Power, click on Power On, and then hope for better results. I'm going to close the old tab for VMTC08, and let's go ahead and open up a new console by right clicking on VMTC08, and from the Action menu, clicking on Open Console right here. Alright, well that looks better. At least it's not in the BIOS setup, which is good. And let's do a ping out to www.google.com. Alright, so it couldn't do name resolution. Let's go ahead and do a ping out to 8.8.8.8. Press enter. Okay, so it says network unreachable. Okay, I do believe that we have a network connectivity problem here. So on this tiny core Linux, let's do an ifconfig and take a look at the interface information. And we have a loopback interface, and I don't see any Ethernet interfaces, which would definitely cause a lack of connectivity if we're trying to communicate starting over an Ethernet network. So let's do this. Let's go ahead and go back to the vSphere web client, and let's right click on VMTC08. And then from the Actions menu for that VM, let's go ahead and click on Edit Settings. Let's see whether or not it has an Ethernet network adapter. So with VM hardware selected right here, and we go down the list, CPU, memory, hard disk, CD, video. I do not see a network card, so let's go ahead and add one. So down here where it says New Device, we'll go ahead and use the icon to bring up the menu for New Device. And we'll go ahead and select Network as the new type of hardware that we're going to add. And then with that selected, we'll go ahead and click on the Add button right here. And not only do we want to have a new network adapter, but we also want to make sure that we're connecting to the correct port group. So from the drop-down list right here, I believe New VM Network is the port group that we want. Now to verify that real quick, we could go ahead and minimize this work in progress using these upper two arrows right here. And just for a moment, let's click on this networking tab right here. And let's expand our distributed switch. And we have this DSVM port group. And if we click on it, currently that's where we have our other VMs. So that's where we want to put this new network adapter as well, on the distributed switch on a port group called DSVM port group. So we'll go back to our work in progress over here in the upper right by clicking on work in progress and then selecting our edit settings to take us back to where we left off. And then we go ahead and bring this up just a little bit so we have a little more room. And let me resize this as well. And regarding the new network, we'll use the drop down, and I'm going to click on Show More Networks, because this is the port group that we want on the distributed switch, DSVM port group. So select that, click OK, and that looks better. And while we're right here in the settings for this VM, let's go ahead and click on VM options up here at the top. And I'd like to talk with you just for a moment about the boot options. So if we expand the boot options, we have options for the firmware, the boot delay, and the force BIOS setup. So it could have been that when this VM was left, someone had checked this box next to force BIOS setup, which is handy, by the way. If we needed to go to the BIOS setup for a VM, under the VM options, under boot options, we can edit the force BIOS setup, put a check there, and that would force the very next time that machine is powered up to go to the BIOS setup. And for this VM, it's very possible that was set because it caused it to go into BIOS setup, and then we rebooted it, and it didn't go into setup. It just launched the operating system as normal. And the firmware option here is grayed out at the moment, and that's because the VM is currently running. If we collapse the boot options here, and we go down to Advanced, and we expand that, here we have options for debugging and statistics. So if we need to collect more information on that VM, we can record debugging information or statistics information. And we also have an option here under the advanced settings for edit configuration. And I love the warning here. The warning is modify or add configuration parameters as needed for experimental features or as instructed by technical support. So there are times when there's some feature or function that we want to implement that's not supported by the GUI that we have to do here in the advanced features or use Power CLI or some other tool to make those changes. An example would be the VMware.log file. Now that file is kept in the same folder as the virtual machine files. And that log file is periodically rotated. So if we wanted to change, for example, the max size of the VMware.log file for a VM, before it would be rotated and a new file would be created, that's an option that we can set here. Now we could also edit the .vmx configuration file for the VM to go ahead and modify the behavior and parameters of a virtual machine. All right, so I'm not going to change anything here. We'll click on Cancel. And then let's go ahead and click on Virtual Hardware. I want to verify that our new network adapter is there. And so we'll click on OK to save that change. And let's go back to our Hosts and Clusters view right here on this tab. So let's go ahead and close the old tab for that VM. And let's right-click on VMTC-08. And from the menu, click on Open Console. And let's put our cursor in this space right here and press Enter. And let's do an ifconfig. And press Enter. And sure enough, so we edited the hardware, but I think it's going to require a reboot of this virtual machine for it to realize that it has it. So let's go ahead and do that. We'll close this tab. We'll go back to the vSphere web client. We'll right-click on VMTC-08. Go to Power and specify that we want to do a shutdown of the guest OS. Click on Yes. Give that a moment to power off. And then after it's powered off, we'll right-click on it once again. Go to the Power menu for that VM and click Power On. And then we'll go ahead and open up a console for that as well. I'm going to just click on VMTC-08. We'll click on the Summary tab for that VM. Click on the icon here representing the desktop of that VM, which will open a console for us. Then we'll go ahead and click in this space to make sure the VM knows we're talking to it. And we'll type in ifconfig, press Enter. And there we go. So that's a much better sign. We have Ethernet 0. It's got the IP address 1033.101. And if we test it with a ping out to www.google.com, that'll test DNS. It'll also test IP connectivity with our ICMP packets. And we'll do a Control-C to stop, and that looks great. In this nugget, we did three basic things. Number one, we verified that the VM had problems connecting to the internet. Secondly, we resolved it by adding a network adapter and placing it in the correct port group. And third, we verified that it worked. So I hope you enjoyed the lab, and I'll see you in the next video. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.